Welcome back, Year 5. Today we're going to continue our work on decimals. Specifically, we're going to be comparing decimal amounts using the less than, greater than, or equal to symbols. The reason why we're doing this is because if you can compare decimals correctly, it will help reinforce your understanding of the value of decimal amounts. So before we get started on comparing, let's just reinforce what we learned yesterday. So in yesterday's math lesson, we looked at the place values, specifically the tenths and the hundredths place. So we looked at a place value chart like this, and we looked at the relationship between each place. So let's just recap that right now. Starting with the hundreds place. Well, we can visualize what 100 looks like. It's made up of 100 ones or 10 tens. But how do I move from the hundreds to the tens place? Well, the relationship there is that I can divide by 10. If I take a 100 block like that and split it into 10 equal parts, each part will be worth 10. It would look like that blue rod that you see right there. Now, how do I get from the tens to the ones place? It's exactly the same process. I divide by 10 again, and you can visualize that quite clearly. That rod is made up of 10 of those little ones pieces. So if I divide that rod into 10 equal parts, each part will be worth 1. Now, by now you should see the pattern. I divide by 10 each time I move to the right. So to get to the tenths place, I need to take that 1 and divide it by 10. So I want you to imagine again that when we jump over that decimal point, we take out a little magnifying glass and we're zooming in on a ones block. Now, when we take that 1 and split it into 10 equal parts, we get tenths. Those tenths look pretty similar to our tens place. That's why they have that similar name. However, it takes 10 tenths to make 1. So that green rod that you see right there in the tens place, it will take 10 of those to equal just 1 in the ones place. Well, how do I get from the tens place to the hundreds place? Same step again. If I take one of those tenths from the tenths place and I divide it by 10, I'll get to the hundredths place. So see that green rod in the tenths place? If I cut that into 10 equal parts, I'd get one of those hundredths, those green hundredths in the hundredths place. By looking at that picture of the hundredths place, how many hundredths do I need to make 1? Well, we can see the whole yellow square is equal to 1, so I need 100 hundredths to make 1, just like I needed 10 tenths to make 1. So there's that relationship there. As we move to the right, we divide by 10. And as we move to the left, we multiply by 10. With that in mind, let's consider a problem. So for this problem, I want to compare two values. Which is bigger, 0.4 or 0.04? Well, what I'm going to need to do is look at that place value. Let's illustrate the place value of these two amounts and see what they look like. So on the left, you can see 0.4. That 4 is in the tenths place because it's directly to the right of the decimal point. So that would be 4 of those tenths shaded in. Those tenths, remember, they look kind of like the rods from the tens place. Now, if I move over to the other value, 0.04, the 4 is in the hundredths place, which means those pieces are smaller. So I take that block and it's split into hundreds, and I only shade in 4 of them, as you can see right there. So which value is bigger, 0.4 or 0.04? Well, clearly based on that illustration, it's 0.4. 4 tenths are greater than 4 hundredths. Let's look at another problem like that. What about 0.5 and 0.25? Which is bigger? Well, I need to remember my place value. 0.5 is 5 tenths, whereas 0.25 is 2 tenths because a 2 is in the tens place, and 5 hundredths because there's a 5 in the hundredths place. Let's illustrate that now and see what they look like in comparison to each other. Here's 0.5 or 5 tenths. I've taken a whole, that big yellow square, and split it into 10 equal parts. Each of those parts is worth 1 tenth. So 5 of them had to be shaded because there's a 5 in the tenths place. What about 0.25? Well, here's 0.25. Because there was a 2 in the tenths place, I had to shade in 2 full columns. That ended up being 10 hundredths each, or 20 hundredths altogether. Then I had to shade 5 more little squares because there's a 5 in the hundredths place, and each little square is worth 1 hundredth. So I could think of 0.25 as 2/10 and 5 hundredths, or I could actually just think of it as 25 hundredths, because if you count up all those little squares, you'll see that that adds up to 25. So which of these values is bigger now that we look at it? Well, even though you might initially have thought 0.5 would be smaller because 5 is smaller than 25, we actually see that 5/10 is twice as much as 0.25. That's because 5/10, that's 5 in the tens place, is obviously larger than a 2 in the tens place, and tenths are bigger than hundredths. Let's try comparing some more decimal amounts now. Here I have 3 sets of decimals for comparison. First I have 0.75 compared to 0.6. To help me compare, I'm going to illustrate these. So just like before, I'm using those rods and the little squares to illustrate each number. 0.75 has 7 tenths, so I used 7 rods. And it has 5 hundredths, so I used 5 little squares. Whereas 0.6 has just 6 tenths, so I used 6 rods. When I look at these, I can see that the value of 0.75 is greater, because if I counted those up, just imagining it was just a regular number, it's like looking at the number 75 and the number 60. So clearly 0.75 is larger than 0.6. So I've put in my greater than symbol so that this statement now reads 0.75 is greater than 0.6. Remember, the crocodile mouth eats the bigger number. Now let's move on to that next set, 0.11 compared to 0.3. Let's illustrate them first. So first, when I illustrate 0.11, I see I have 1/10, so I put down 1 rod, and I have 1/100, so I put 1 small square. For 0.3, what's important is to look at where that 3 is. It's in the tenths place. That means I need to put 3 rods. So when I look at these and I'm comparing them, I realize that 0.3 is actually larger. This means my statement should read 0.11 is less than 0.3. Don't get confused and think that this is saying something like 11 compared to 3. If you want to ignore that decimal point, it's really like comparing 11 to 30, because the 3 is in the tenths place and we represent it with rods, which look a lot like tens. However, keep in mind, of course, we're still dealing with fraction amounts here. Now let's look at our last example, 0.4 and 0.49. Again, don't think of it as 4 and 49. The 4 is in the tenths place. That means for 0.4, I need to put down 4 rods. It almost looks like 40. Then for 0.49, I have another 4 in the tenths place, so I put 4 rods, but I also have 9 in the hundredths place, so I put 9 small squares. So that one looks like 49. When I look at these now, I see that 0.49 is larger, but I realize that 0.4 is actually quite close to 0.49. So I've put in my comparison symbol so that the statement reads 0.4 is less than 0.49. What about 0.2 and 0.20? Which one's bigger? I bet you realize I'm trying to trick you. What we need to do first is try to imagine what these two numbers look like. Let's illustrate them. When I look at the left side, 0.2 has 2 in the tenths place. That means I put down 2 rods. When I look to the right hand side at 0.20, it also has 2 in the tenths place. So I put down 2 rods. And I notice it has nothing in the hundredths place, so I don't put anything else. That means these two values are exactly the same. They are equal. There's another way to think of it though. You could look at this as asking you to compare 0.2 or 2 tenths compared to 0.20 or 20 hundredths. So 2 tenths versus 20 hundredths. Well, 2 tenths is my 2 rods. 20 hundredths is 20 little squares. But remember, 10 of those little squares is the same as 1 rod. So I still end up with 2 rods or 2 tenths. So no matter how I look at it, these two values are equal. 2 2/10 is the same thing as 20 hundredths because they both have a 2 in the tenths place. Now it's time for some independent work. Before you start it, please head up your book with the date, the topic, and the learning intention. For your independent work, you are going to use the less than, greater than, and equal to symbols to compare these sets of decimal values. You can refer to the tenths and hundredths grid on the right-hand side of your screen for support. They can help you to visualize what each decimal will look like. Or you could also, like I did on previous slides, draw it out using the tenths rods and the hundredths little squares. That will help you to compare. When you have finished your independent task and sent a picture of it to me, you can go onto iExcel and do one of these starred assignments. Please don't spend too much time focusing on tasks that do not have stars next to them on iExcel. I see a lot of you are doing other things, which is good, but make sure you've done at least some decimal work for the day. All of these starred skills are things that we will be covering this week, so make sure you focus on those first. All right, you guys, as always, stay safe and I'll see you soon.